The midday sun
Get your
beat down
trash away from
mercilessly
our
against the
building.
concrete plaza in front of Prestige Corporate Group's Manhattan headquarters. Skyscrapers of polished glass and black steel towered over the city, reflecting the blinding rays like giant mirrors. At the base of the central tower, nestled right beside the gleaming glass revolving doors, stood a crude wooden cart filled with fresh produce. Tomatoes, crisp lettuce, and yellow lemons rested in weathered wooden crates. Tied to the front of the cart, with fraying twine, was a torn piece of cardboard bearing handwritten block letters, "Street Vendor**." Behind the cart stood a young man whose appearance stood in stark contrast to the surrounding grandeur. He looked no older than 26. His faded gray t-shirt was tattered and torn at the right shoulder, covered in dark streaks of grease and soil. Dirt smeared his cheeks, his jaw, and his forearms. A stained navy work apron hung loosely around his neck. His brown hair was matted and unwashed. He bent his head low, shifting uncomfortably in his worn leather boots as executive after executive brushed past him without a second glance. To the high-flying corporate executives of Prestige Corporate Group, he was invisible. He was just another piece of urban clutter to be stepped around, an eyesore on the polished plaza. None of them knew his real name was Julian Vance. None of them knew that Julian held a master's degree in corporate finance from Oxford University, or that he was the only son and sole heir of Arthur Vance, the formidable billionaire founder and principal CEO of Prestige Corporate Group. For 3 years, Julian had lived abroad, running the company's international operations in London and Singapore. But 2 weeks ago, his father had summoned him back to New York with a monumental announcement. Arthur was preparing to step down, and Julian was slated to take the reins as chief executive officer. Yet Julian had hesitated. In his years managing remote offices, he had heard disturbing rumors regarding the corporate culture at headquarters. Reports spoke of rampant arrogance, systemic mistreatment of low-level staff, and extreme elitism led by the senior executive team. Julian knew that a company built on vanity and cruelty would eventually collapse under its own weight. He refused to inherit an empire built on rotten pillars. "If I am to lead these people," Julian had told his father in a private meeting 3 days prior, "I must see who they truly are when they believe no one of power is watching. I want to test their character from the dirt." Arthur Vance had agreed. Only Arthur and the head of security knew the truth. Julian was given 3 days to operate disguised as a humble street vendor directly outside the main entrance of his own family's headquarters. For the first 2 days, Julian observed in silence. Most employees simply ignored him. They bought their coffee at high-end cafes, talked loudly into their phones about multi-million-dollar venture deals, and looked right through him. A few low-level office clerks and janitorial staff were surprisingly kind. One junior analyst had even bought 2 lemons and left a $5 tip, telling him to stay safe in the heat. Julian had quietly noted their names. But on the 3rd day, the real test began. At precisely 12:15 p.m., the heavy revolving doors of the Prestige Tower pushed open, releasing a group of senior executives heading out for lunch. At the center of the group walked Victor Sterling. Victor was the senior vice president of corporate operations. Dressed in a navy blue bespoke suit with a gold tie clip and a Patek Philippe watch gleaming on his wrist, Victor moved with the obnoxious arrogance of a man who believed he owned the sidewalk. Beside him was his fiancée, Victoria Croft, the director of corporate public relations. Victoria wore a striking crimson dress, a diamond necklace, and carried a black Yves Saint Laurent leather handbag tucked under her arm. Flanking them were 3 junior directors, all laughing heartily at Victor's jokes. Victor was the primary candidate, vying for the CEO position if Julian did not take it. He was brilliant with numbers, but ruthless with people. As the group walked toward the plaza exit, Victor gestured animatedly to his colleagues, not paying attention to his path. Julian deliberately took a small step forward, maneuvering his cart slightly. Victor's polished leather shoe clipped the wooden frame of the cart. The sudden impact caused Victor to stumble, dropping his leather-bound tablet onto the concrete pavement. The laughter among the executives stopped instantly. Victor straightened up, his face flushing deep crimson with rage. He looked down at his scuffed shoe, then at his dropped tablet, and finally at Julian standing meekly beside the wooden cart. "Are you completely blind, you filthy parasite?" Victor roared, his voice echoing across the open courtyard. Julian dropped his chin, pulling his shoulders inward to play the part of a terrified, impoverished vendor. I'm so sorry, sir," Julian stammered, using a soft, trembling tone. "It was an accident. The wheel slipped on the uneven pavement." "Do you have any idea what these shoes cost?" Victor snapped, stepping aggressively into Julian's personal space. "This suit costs more than you will make in your entire miserable lifetime. You dare place this pile of garbage in front of our main doors." Victoria Croft stepped up beside Victor, her face twisted in a look of profound disgust. She pulled her silk scarf slightly over her nose, as if Julian emitted a foul odor. "Victor, darling, don't get your blood pressure up over a gutter rat," she sneered loudly. "Just call security and have him thrown in jail. Look at him, he's making our building look like a slum." The three junior directors joined in, snickering and shaking their heads. "Hey kid," one director called out, "this is Prestige Corporate Group, not a flea market. Get your dirty hands off the crates." Julian kept his head bowed. "Please, ma'am, sir, I'm just trying to make an honest living. My father is sick, and I need to sell these vegetables to pay for his medicine." It was a test line, a deliberate play to check for a single drop of human empathy. Victor did not show a single drop. Instead, he threw his head back and let out a harsh, mocking laugh. "You're sick, father," Victor mocked, leaning forward until his face was inches from Julian's dirt-smeared skin. "Nobody cares about your pathetic life. If you can't afford medicine, that's what happens to useless nobodies who sell tomatoes on the street." With a sudden, violent movement, Victor raised his leg and kicked the side of the wooden cart. The thin wooden crate shattered. Ripe red tomatoes, heads of lettuce, and yellow lemons tumbled onto the concrete, rolling across the dirty pavement. Several tomatoes burst open, splattering red juice across Julian's worn leather boots. "Look at that," Victor laughed, pointing a manicured finger right at Julian's face. "There goes your medicine money, boy." Victoria burst into a high-pitched, theatrical laugh, clapping her hands together in delight. She reached up to cover her mouth, her diamond rings catching the sunlight as she watched the destruction. The junior directors roared with laughter, one of them crossing his arms in absolute amusement. A small crowd of onlookers began to gather near the plaza edge. Security guards stood near the entrance, but recognizing Victor Sterling, they remained frozen, afraid to intervene against a senior vice president. Julian dropped down to his knees on the hard concrete. He began picking up the bruised tomatoes with trembling hands, dirtying his fingers even further. He squeezed his eyes shut, forcing real tears of anger and frustration to overflow. A single teardrop cut a clean path down through the dark grime on his left cheek. Victor stepped closer, looming over the kneeling young man. He raised his loud, booming voice so that every employee in the plaza could hear him clearly. "Let this be a lesson to you," Victor shouted, pointing his finger down at Julian's face while laughing maniacally. "You are bottom-tier trash. You are nothing. People like you exist only to serve people like me. If I ever see your ugly, dirty face near this building again, I'll personally have you thrown into a cage." Victoria laughed harder, her voice ringing out across the stone pillars. "Clean up your mess, street boy," she taunted. Julian sat on his knees in the dirt, surrounded by crushed vegetables. He looked at Victor's wide, laughing mouth, at Victoria's amused face, and at the cackling executives surrounding them. He registered every single face. He memorized every single expression. The test was complete. The mask was ready to fall. Julian slowly stopped picking up the vegetables. He wiped the single tear from his cheek with the back of his dirty sleeve. Then he stood up. He didn't stand up like a defeated vendor. He straightened his back, pulling his shoulders straight, throwing his head back with a calm, imposing posture that caused Victor's laughter to falter slightly. Julian met Victor's eyes directly. The soft, fearful trembling in Julian's eyes was completely gone, replaced by a cold, razor-sharp steel that chilled Victor to his core. "Are you finished?" Julian asked. His voice was no longer stuttering or meek. It was deep, commanding, and resonated across the silent plaza like a strike of thunder. Victor blinked, momentarily caught off guard by the sudden shift in atmosphere, but his pride quickly took over. "What did you say to me, you piece of—" "I asked if you were finished laughing, Mr. Sterling," Julian interrupted coldly. Victoria's laughter died instantly. She looked at the vendor, a strange, creeping sensation of dread forming in her stomach. "How do you know my name?" Victor demanded, his brow furrowing. "Security, get out here right now and throw this lunatic off the property." "Security will stay right where they are," a thunderous voice boomed from the building entrance. The revolving glass doors spun open with violent speed. Out stepped Arthur Vance, the principal founder and chief executive officer of Prestige Corporate Group. He was accompanied by 6 executive security officers and the chief legal counsel. Arthur's face was dark with an unbridled fury that made even the air feel heavy. Victor immediately wiped the smirk off his face, straightening his jacket. "Mr. Vance," Victor said quickly, stepping forward with a fake, charming smile. "Sir, I apologize for the commotion out here. This homeless street vendor was harassing our staff and blocking the entrance. I was simply handling the situation and removing the nuisance for the company's reputation." Arthur Vance did not look at Victor. He walked straight past the senior vice president, his eyes fixed on the young man in the torn, dirty apron standing amidst the crushed tomatoes. Before the eyes of 50 stunned corporate employees, the billionaire founder of Prestige Corporate Group stopped in front of the vendor. Arthur took off his own custom cashmere suit jacket, stepped forward, and gently draped it over Julian's filthy, grease-stained shoulders. Then Arthur bowed his head slightly. "I am sorry you had to endure this, son." A collective gasp echoed through the plaza. Victor's face went dead white. His jaw dropped so low it looked dislocated. Beside him, Victoria dropped her YSL handbag onto the dirty pavement, her eyes wide with sheer terror. The junior directors froze like statues, all color draining from their expressions. "Son," Victor stammered, his voice squeaking pathetically. "Mr. Vance, who is he?" Julian slowly unclasped the stained navy apron around his neck and let it drop onto the pile of ruined tomatoes. He adjusted his father's cashmere jacket over his shoulders, stepping forward until he stood inches from Victor Sterling. "My name is Julian Vance," he declared, his voice echoing clearly across the courtyard. "I am the sole heir to Prestige Corporate Group, and as of 8 o'clock this morning, the board of directors officially ratified my appointment as the incoming chief executive officer." Victoria let out a quiet, terrified squeak, pulling her hand to her throat. The diamond rings that had just clicked in celebration now felt like lead weight. Julian Vance," Victor whispered, his knees visibly trembling inside his navy trousers. The son from Oxford, the head of international operations." "The very same," Julian said softly. He stepped closer to Victor, his gray eyes locking onto the man's sweating forehead. "You told me 10 seconds ago that I was bottom-tier trash. You told me that people like me exist only to serve people like you. You mocked my father, and you crushed the harvest of a man trying to earn an honest dollar." "Mr. Vance, Julian, please," Victor pleaded, his voice cracking with desperate panic. Sweat poured down his temples, ruining his groomed appearance. "I didn't know. I swear to God I didn't know it was you. If I had known you were the CEO's son, I would never." "That is precisely the problem, Victor," Julian interrupted sharply, his tone cutting through Victor's excuses like a razor. "You only show respect to power. You treat those above you with sycophantic praise, and you step on those beneath you with ruthless cruelty. You believed I was powerless, and so you showed me who you truly are." Julian turned his gaze to Victoria Croft, who was trembling so violently she had to hold onto the stone pillar behind her. "And you, Miss Croft," Julian said, his eyes scanning her crimson dress. "You are the director of public relations. Your entire job is to represent the values and human decency of this corporation. Yet, you stood here laughing while a human being was degraded and kicked into the dirt. Julian, please, Victoria sobbed, tears ruining her heavy mascara. It was a mistake. Victor started it, I was just. Save your breath, Julian commanded. Julian turned back to his father, who stood beside the chief legal counsel with a grim, resolute expression. Father, is the legal team prepared? Julian asked. Everything is signed and ready, CEO Vance, Arthur replied formally. Julian turned back to face Victor Sterling, Victoria Croft, and the three junior directors. The entire plaza was deathly silent. Employees hung out of office windows above, watching the public execution of the company's top executives. Victor Sterling, Julian announced, his voice carrying maximum authority. Effective immediately, you are terminated from your position as Senior Vice President of Operations. Furthermore, based on the internal audit I conducted over the past 48 hours while standing at this very cart, our legal team is filing formal charges against you for embezzlement, contract fraud, and corporate extortion. Victor gasped, clutching his chest. You audited me. I had full access to the mainframe from my laptop inside the vendor cart, Julian said coldly. You have been stealing from this company's lower-level pension funds for 18 months. You won't just be leaving this building, you will be leaving in handcuffs. As if on cue, two marked police cruisers pulled up to the curb of the plaza, sirens flashing silently. Four armed officers stepped out, walking directly toward Victor. No, please, Mr. Vance, give me another chance, Victor screamed as the officers grabbed his arms, pulling them behind his navy suit to slide the steel handcuffs onto his wrists. I worked 10 years for this company. And you spent those 10 years destroying its soul, Julian replied without a drop of pity. Julian then turned his attention to Victoria Croft. Miss Croft, you are fired as Director of Public Relations. I am personally ensuring your industry license is revoked for gross misconduct. Pack your desk. You have 10 minutes to clear the premises. Victoria burst into hysterical tears, covering her face as she stumbled backward toward the glass doors, completely disgraced in front of the entire staff. Finally, Julian looked at the three junior directors who had joined in on the laughter. All three men were bowed low, practically shaking in their boots. As for the three of you, Julian said, you are demoted back to entry-level analysts. Your salaries are halved, and you will spend the next 6 months performing mandatory community service and corporate ethics training. If I hear one word of complaint, you will follow Victor to state prison. Thank you, sir. Thank you, CEO Vance. The three directors babbled in unison, bowing repeatedly in sheer desperation. Julian turned away from them, walking back toward the center of the plaza. He looked around at the gathered crowd of office workers, janitors, security personnel, and clerks who were watching in absolute silence. Julian raised his voice so everyone could hear. Let this day serve as a permanent declaration to every single employee of Prestige Corporate Group, Julian proclaimed. From this moment forward, title and wealth do not grant you privilege to demean others. Arrogance will not be tolerated in these halls. We build our empire on integrity, humility, and human dignity. Anyone who forgets how to treat a human being will be cast out of this company instantly. A beat of total silence hung in the air. Then, from near the revolving doors, a lone security guard began to clap. A janitor joined in. Within seconds, a wave of thunderous applause exploded across the entire plaza. Office workers cheered from the open windows above, their voices echoing off the tall glass skyscrapers. The toxic cloud of fear and arrogance that had hung over the company for years was shattered in a single afternoon. Julian looked down at the crushed tomatoes and broken crates on the ground. He bent down, picked up a single undamaged lemon from the dirt, and held it in his hand. He walked over to a young junior clerk standing in the crowd, the same young man who had bought 2 lemons from him yesterday and left a tip for his sick father. Julian placed the clean lemon in the clerk's hand and patted his shoulder. "What's your name, son?" Julian asked gently. Marcus Reed, sir," the boy stammered in shock. Well, Marcus, Julian smiled warmly, as of tomorrow, you are the new Assistant Director of Public Relations. Report to the executive floor at 8 sharp. Marcus's eyes filled with tears of joy. Thank you, CEO Vance. Julian turned back to his father. Arthur Vance stood with a proud, tearful smile, offering his son a firm nod of approval. Together, father and son turned and walked through the heavy glass doors into the main lobby of Prestige Corporate Group, stepping into a new era of leadership built not on pride, but on decency. And so ends the story of how a billionaire's son chose to descend into the dirt to test his empire. Julian Vance proved that true power does not lie in custom suits or expensive watches, but in the courage to defend the humble and punish the proud. Titles may buy authority, but only character commands real respect.